outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday Late Show with me, Hannah Wilson. Tonight we've got Rachel here talking about her lovely new book, The A to Z of Diversity and Inclusion, part of the A to Z series over at John Catt. And if you are intrigued and want to know more about the stories or the series of books, then you can go visit them over at johncattbookshop.com, and there are lovely partners over there, so you can use our discount code as well. So you've got JCTTR2425 and you get 20% off this book. So not only are you going to hear all about it firsthand, and trust me, I've been reading it and it's such a good read, so I highly recommend you go over there and get it, but you can get it with 20% off, which is even better. So thank you so much, Rachel, for kind of joining me tonight on this cold and wintry evening. I feel like winter has crept up far too quickly this year.
I know, it's dark and bleak outside, but thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
How did you get involved in this series?
Yeah, I've known Roy Blatchford, the series editor, for a long time. When I was a head teacher in London, I used to run leadership training programs for London Leadership Strategy. And from time to time, I would persuade Roy to come and be a keynote speaker at one of those events. And he's such a sort of lively and engaging thinker and speaker and writer. And he's written a number of books for John Catt, all of which I've read and were really helpful to me as a school leader. And I've kept in touch with him. And I wrote a book back in 2021 called Obstetrics the Schools, which is all about creating high performance cultures in schools. And Roy very kindly wrote the foreword for that book. So he emailed me probably about 18 months ago and said that he was working on this A to Z series, and he'd got a whole load of book titles of future volumes in the series, and could I recommend anybody from my network and sort of contact list of people that might be good authors for some of the books, because at that point I had moved out of headship and I was a director of education services for a big school improvement organisation. And I had a team of about 80 to 100 advisors and consultants who are great educationalists and experts in their field. So I think he thought, and he was quite right, that I'd have some names in mind of people that would make really good authors. But I was very cheeky because I read down the list and I saw that one of the books that he'd got proposed was an A to Z of Diversity and Inclusion. And I thought, oh, I'd like to write that one. And I was just coming to the end of writing a book around race equity, a book that came out in 2013 called Unity and Diversity. So I was really sort of steeped in looking at diversity in terms of racial diversity. And my book was very much about how school leaders can create a culture of race equity in their schools. So I'd got all these ideas percolating around diversity and inclusion for children from global majority backgrounds, but also within the team that I was leading, we've got some brilliant expertise around inclusion in relation to SEND and children who are refugees and asylum seekers and other marginalised groups or minoritized groups. So, I just thought, I can really see that from some of the work I'm doing in schools and settings and some of the great practice that I'm seeing all around the sort of region that I was based in at the time, I could pull together an A to Z that was around diversity and inclusion. So luckily, when I suggested that, Roy said, yeah, you can do that one.
Because that's the thing, I think it's just such a interesting topic. And we were chatting just beforehand, that I think it's one of those that schools don't often get right. And I think it's one of those that if you can get it right, it just makes such a difference to the school. But it is kind of really it's so wide, but there's actually just lots of little things, isn't it? It's like those marginal gains. If you can get all these little things right, it can have this really big impact on a school and make such a difference to these kids in terms of what they can achieve. And I think that just flows throughout it, is that kind of it's all about the kids. It's all about kind of getting the best out of them. And it's just such a lovely little read. And I think it's also that A to Z, obviously with all the letters, you can kind of pop in and out onto the areas that you kind of like and the things you want to know about. You don't have to necessarily read it in A to Z order. You can kind of pop in and out. But that's, I'm guessing that's the kind of the purpose of the books by doing them a bit like that.
Yeah, so you've triggered a few thoughts there. I mean, firstly, I think you're absolutely right that every school is, and if they're not, they should be challenged by the issue of how do you include all learners and all staff? Because I think, you know, we're educating children at the moment in a society that has huge social inequities. And we're seeing, you know, the children that come through our school gates come from such a diversity of backgrounds and previous lived experience and education experience. And that's a huge challenge for us, whatever type of school or setting or age or phase, you know, we're working in. So I think it is a challenge, absolutely everywhere. Having said that, I think there are many schools and settings that are getting aspects of, if not the whole piece of, you know, diversity and inclusion right, and doing things that are having really demonstrable impact, and, you know, which we ought to learn from. I also think it's a great topic to write on, because literally everybody who works in a school or setting can play a part. You know, there's something that absolutely everybody can do, from the front office receptionist to the catering staff to the caretakers to the senior leaders to the ECTs to the heads of department or phase. You know, it literally is everybody's business, you know, making a school more diverse in its representation and more equitable and inclusive in its sort of culture and ethos. But it's the first time I've ever written a book using the structure of, you know, 26 letters of the alphabet, 26 short chapters. And it was really good fun to think of, you know, what were going to be the themes of my 26 chapters, particularly some of the more sort of obscure letters, and how I was going to make sure all the chapters did link one into the other, so that if somebody did want to read it from page 1 right through to the end, it wouldn't seem disjointed. So there is a sort of route through the book. But as you say, I think the beauty of the books in this series is that they're short chapters. They're 26 sort of mini essays, if you like, with provocations and activities and suggestions and questions. And you can knock off one in about 5 minutes. So, you know, for a busy school leader or teacher who's, you know, had a long day and just kind of collapses into bed and wants to read something, you know, for 5 minutes before they crash out, you can read a chapter, and you can literally pick any chapter. You can flick through and think, oh, you know, I'm really interested in belonging today, or status, or whatever it is, and just go to that chapter. And so they all exist sort of as an entity in and of themselves.
And that's the thing that I think I really like about it, is that it's that kind of, they've got those questions at the end of each chapter that just make you be really reflective. And I don't think we do enough of that as teachers, that we pause and reflect and ask ourselves, do we do this, or how do we do this, or how could we do this, how could we implement it, and kind of really think about what we're doing and the impact it's having. And sometimes we kind of read all this research and it's like, okay, right now I need to go and do that, but we're not actually asking ourselves, what do we do well already, where can we implement it, what can we change, what is it, the purpose of it. And it's, I found myself, I love a bit of reflectiveness, and sometimes I'm like, I don't do that enough. I don't like, actually, this is taking that, like you said, that stop, even whether it's at the end of the day, if you're at leadership, just popping in and reading it, and then being reflective and thinking, what are we doing, how can we change this, how can we implement it. It's just such an important aspect to do in teaching.
Yeah, so for anyone listening who hasn't come across any of the books in this A to Z series, they all finish with what's called an aside, and an aside might be a quotation that's just sort of stimulating or thought-provoking. It could be a little case study or an excerpt of what a school's done, with a couple of questions about, you know, what might you learn from that? How could you transfer it into your school or setting? Sometimes they're deliberate sort of provocations or prompts. And sometimes it's a list of questions or a sort of challenge. So, for example, the chapter in my book, X, you know, which is, you can imagine, is quite a difficult sort of theme. I've cheated a little bit, and X is for extra. I figured if you can have like an XXL on a label in a jumper, and everyone knows it means extra, then, you know, X is okay as extra. And that chapter is all about how, if you're really striving to be an equitable school, you will think about what extra you can do for your children and your staff who are more likely to be underserved or to feel a bit excluded or marginalized, or could potentially, you know, not have such a strong sense of belonging, for example. And the aside for that, I just sort of say, you know, X is also the Roman numeral for 10. Can you write a list of 10 ways in which you could do extra for your underserved learners? So sometimes they're little sort of puzzles or tasks.
And that's the thing. Like, I think a lot of schools have got kind of diversity and inclusion on their school action plan, and actually this would fit in really well into like your whole school CPD of kind of, here's your reading, read this beforehand, and then actually as a group task kind of read the questions. So I think it's really lovely in that respect as well, that these could be easily transferred into a whole school policy as opposed to it necessarily just being somebody to read it. I think that kind of aspect of, you could easily make it a big group thing as well with those questions is quite a nice thing.
Yeah, so I know quite a few schools have got copies of the book, and perhaps, all of SLT has got a copy, and they'll read a chapter before a meeting, and then they'll have a focused discussion that's provoked or stimulated by that chapter. And it's not like, asking a busy senior leader to go away and read a whole book. It's literally a sort of 5-minute preparation task. And likewise, I think, you're right, these chapters can be used for training or for CPD, or they can just provoke ideas for assemblies. So every chapter starts with a quotation related to the theme. And I'm a great fan of quotations. I always use them as chapter headings in my books, because when I was a teacher and a leader, I'd often like to build a tutor time activity or an assembly around a quotation. But it takes time to find them, kind of, scavenge away to get good quotations. So I really like finding new quotations that you haven't seen around before and sort of peppering them into my writing.
Oh, that's literally like every book I read, I like highlight something and then put it in like in a little spreadsheet of like, here's my new quotation. Like I just think it's that thing, isn't it, that we all need a bit of inspiration and a bit of kind of like philosophical kind of guidance. I think it's really interesting. How easy was it to come up with those kind of words to kind of link in and put in? Because I was like, oh yeah, no, that one's an obvious that one's an obvious one, and they're like, oh, that's something a little bit more tricky. I'd have struggled, or some of the words you've come up with, I think, kind of really work, but I wouldn't necessarily instantly thought of them for those letters. Did you kind of do the ones you knew first and then kind of fill in the gaps, or did you have the structure before you started writing the chapters?
So what did I do? I literally wrote A to Z down a page, in a list, and started playing around with ideas that I wanted to put in the book, and concepts that I wanted to cover, and stories that I wanted to tell, and great practice that I wanted to sort of spotlight and highlight, because I didn't want to be too slavishly directed by the structure of the A to Z. I wanted to make sure that I could, get all the messages that I wanted to get across into the book, by hook or by crook. So I ended up with using chapter titles, sometimes that were really obviously really obvious from the letter. So A for ambition, for example. But I didn't go for really obvious associations too much, because one of the other challenges that Roy Blatchford gave the writers was to try to use different words, for letter C or letter F or whatever. So, I think I did use questioning for Q, but I imagine, it's quite difficult to think of, lots of alternatives to that. The X, Y, Zs are tricky. I went for extra, yes, and zero tolerance. You weren't really supposed to have hyphenated words, but I managed to get zero tolerance past the editors after a bit of a fight. And I really wanted to end the book. I was really pleased that yes and zero tolerance came sort of bookended at the end, because I really wanted to start with the A for ambition and to say, you have to believe it's possible to include everybody. You have to believe it's possible to for everybody to have a voice and a say and status in school. You have to think big and aspirationally for everybody if you want to create a school that's really strong on diversity and inclusion. And so returning it to that sort of concept at the end and saying, if you have a culture where you say yes to challenges as opposed to no, we can't do that because, rather you say yes and we'll need the support, or yes and it's going to take some time, or yes and we're going to do it in this way, then that's really powerful. And the zero tolerance, just not allowing yourself to give up or to let anybody off or to have lower expectations or to put glass ceilings on what you can do. That was a really nice way of just sort of looping back to this sort of initial message of the book. But then for some of the chapters, I didn't really choose a word that was about the theme. It was just in a way a bridge word. So the C chapter is called Cavalcade, which is a really kind of bizarre, word, and people might think, what on earth's that about? But I use the sort of analogy of an advantaged learner having almost the equivalent of a sort of cavalcade, like a member of the royal family has if they're going up Whitehall, or a top politician or dignitary has if they are kind of zooming through London with police escort and the motorcycles at the front, and then the armoured smoked glass kind of 4x4s in which they kind of whoosh along the road, and how travelling through school and navigating all the transitions, if you're advantaged, is a bit like travelling through London as a VIP with this cavalcade of support. Whereas for underserved learners or children who are facing barriers to their learning or challenges, they're sort of navigating their way through education without any cavalcade or police escort or protection or advocacy around them. And we as educators have to step in and be that cavalcade for them. So yeah, some of the terms are a bit more obscure.
Do you think that's I find that quite interesting, that do you think as teachers, if you haven't kind of been through that and realised that you haven't the difference of privilege, and that if you are from the privileged background and you've just kind of gone into teaching and you haven't had to deal with that they can necessarily understand the kind of struggles that some of the disadvantaged go to? Because there's quite a lot of that, especially whether why don't this whole, I find it so shocking that so many houses don't have books in them and parents don't read with their children, but that's just kind of a disadvantage. That's my privilege is that I have a mother who's a teacher, so a primary school teacher. So I had the advantage of kind of phonics and reading and that being our routine because she knew how important it is. But if they don't have that at home, but for us as teachers, quite often we're educated and it's quite a normal thing for us to experience. Do you think that that's kind of something that teachers struggle with, and that's why sometimes these kids are kind of let down, that they're not necessarily getting the support to kind of be there because they don't really understand why why they've got that extra privilege? We don't necessarily see it as that.
Yeah, I think it can be. I think it's really easy for people who haven't had certain lived experiences to find it hard to understand how that might really limit or impact you. So, many people working in schools haven't had lived experience of poverty and, being hungry or really worrying about the roof over your head or how the bills are going to be paid, or being set a homework task that has to be done on the internet when you don't have Wi-Fi connectivity at home. So I think it's really, really important that in schools we are kind of opening our eyes to the lived experience of children with SEND if we don't have special educational needs or disabilities ourselves, or children who have come from a war zone and have arrived in the UK with no possessions, going into a situation where it might have been really routine for a primary class teacher to do a kind of show and tell activity, and yet they've got nothing to show and, nothing, that they're probably going to want to tell. So I think sometimes completely unconsciously and without meaning to, we can make assumptions that everybody can afford this, or everybody's had that experience, or everybody will know when I talk about X, Y, or Z, or nobody's going to feel nervous coming up and presenting, or without thinking about the huge diversity of experience, confidence, status, sense of belonging, in the classes in front of us, which is why addressing our privileges and thinking about our potential sort of unconscious biases is really, really important. And that's what I'm trying to do in a small way through the book, just to, remind people about certain lived experiences and how, if you're a child who is marginalized in one way or another, you might in a certain situation feel really invisible, and as though the school, the curriculum, the text, the resources, the displays aren't representing you, or aren't talking to you, or aren't recognizing you. I mean, a great example is children from Roma traveller gypsy backgrounds who are almost sort of invisible in the curriculum and in resources, but equally, and the I chapter is about invisibility. But equally, sometimes children from marginalised or underrepresented backgrounds can feel hypervisible. And the H chapter, juxtaposed next to the I chapter, is called hypervisibility. Because if we're not careful, sometimes we can make children feel very sort of uncomfortably visible in certain situations.
It's and that's the thing. There was just so many little bits, and ironic. We were talking about traveller children on a previous show that we did recently, and I think I've got a student in my class who's now gone for 6 months, and then we'll be back and stuff. And it's like, right, how do I address that gap? How do I? But like, she's so open with it, and really, like, I love teaching her and just pick it up and stuff where she's left off, and kind of make her feel very welcome when she comes back and things. But I think unless you it's one of those that I've been in it 13 years and I haven't had that really as a student. I think I've had one early on in my career, but you don't necessarily come across the same students year in, year out. Everything does change, and the diversity and the range that change. So it's important as us as teachers, we have a responsibility to adapt and make sure we are including them. I know when I kind of did when we had COVID, I kind of really reflected and did a bit of an audit on my curriculum and realised I didn't have a lot of variety in the artists that I teach, and massively changed kind of the different artists that I did, and put in artists that kind of had the conversations and brought those conversations in the classroom. I did Guerrilla Girls and their women's representation in art, because actually GCSEs, it's mainly girls that are taking it up, but actually you're far less likely to be successful as a female artist and then get paid for it, and discussing that. And there's an artist, Adrian Brandon, who paints people for 1 minute for every hour that they were alive when they've been killed under the hands of police in America, and talk about that and how we can use art in a positive way to kind of highlight things, and suddenly gets kids talking about different topics that they're not used to talking about. And I think sometimes we as educators shy away from it because it's not our normal, and actually we should be comfortable in kind of exploring topics that we might not know nothing about, and putting ourselves into those situations and making it relevant for our students. And kind of is that it's not being afraid to adapt with it, is it?
I think that's such an important point. The K chapter of my book is knowledge. And I write about how it has to be our responsibility as educators to make ourselves more knowledgeable about the lived experience of our pupils that we're not knowledgeable about. So, you know, very many teachers won't have a lot of knowledge about Gypsy Roma traveller heritage. They won't necessarily know some of the sort of language and I suppose customs and traditions. And yet to skill themselves up and make themselves a bit more knowledgeable so that they can ask sort of pertinent questions of a Gypsy Roma traveller child in the class is a great way of, you know, building a connection, a relationship, you know, their self-esteem, etc. Likewise, issues like neurodiversity or I don't know, you know, there are so many facets of children's characteristic and lived experience that that we often aren't good at sort of training ourselves on, that we haven't been trained on in terms of teacher training. I write in the book about a trust that has done some really powerful work about young carers and being a young carer, and how sort of empowering that was for young carers in the trust, that the staff understood the complexity of that sort of better because they've made it part of their sort of CPD program. And likewise, you know, many schools will have young people who perhaps have a parent in prison and are going to visit their parent in prison regularly. But do we really know enough about what that's like and what it's like as a young person to go and visit your mum or dad in prison? You know, if we don't understand that, how can we possibly know what sort of emotional toll that might be taking, or, you know, how that young person might be feeling sort of just before a visit or after a visit? And all of this obviously takes time, but it can be done in a way where somebody sort of skills themselves up as an expert and then, you know, crystallizes the key learning that staff ought to have. And it's just a lovely way of making school more inclusive.
It's that, isn't it? Because it's like, I just feel like when you have the best relationships, when you know your kids, and you don't do it in a really obvious way that you're like kind of pointing out that you know this stuff about them, but you just do it in a really subtle way that makes them realize that you get it and you understand it. Like me at my old school, I'm dyslexic, and we had a secret dyslexia society. Ironically, one of our English teachers was also dyslexic. So when the kids are, I can't write, I'm dyslexic, I was like, so's Misfit. Like, we did a whole show on it together, and like, and it was that kind of like secret, like, well, so am I. But also look at all these great things that come alongside having that. Like, these are my superpowers because I'm dyslexic. It's not a negative, it's a positive. And if we can do it, and we can stand up in front of you and teach, teach, then so can you. But we were also like, we hate it when the kids point out our spelling mistakes in our PowerPoints because it's our fear. Or when a kid asks you to spell a word and I'm like, right, I'm going to have to check that. I have to be honest with them because I was like, the fear of me spelling that wrong in front of you is too much. And it's just, sometimes we forget it's okay for being vulnerable and be on the level with them as well, and realize that these struggles don't go away. Sometimes they're going to be there, but you just kind of cope with them. And I think that like your first chapter, like you said, is ambition, and I just absolutely loved reading this. And but I also think it's one of those that I see post-COVID the kids struggling with the most, that they're kind of lacking that little bit of ambition, lacking kind of aspirations, and lacking resilience in the fact that they just feel a little bit, I don't know whether it is from COVID or feeds from their parents, just a little bit downtrodden, or everything will just happen anyway. It's out of their control, so why bother, kind of thing. But actually it's kind of lifting them up and making sure that all of the kids' needs are met. It's not like that kid that's kind of like not quite getting to school on time because of other things that are going on is just never going to make it because they just can't, they're not putting the effort in, they can't concentrate, it's they're a lost cause. They're not, like, no kid is a lost cause. Every kid can have that ambition and can succeed. It's just finding the bits that will kind of unlock it and not kind of giving up on them. And I just love that kind of theme throughout, and kind of it really, for me, broke it down and kind of was very reflective into, rather than this kind of, there is that kind of societal aspect of like, oh, these youths, they don't bother, they don't want to work, they don't, but actually it is changing, and we can change it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think society's attitude as a whole helps. You know, we have you know, these sort of endpoints at reception at year 6, at year 13, where we, you know, do formal standardized tests. And obviously at GCSE, it doesn't help that, you know, they're set up so that a certain percentage of children have to sort of technically not reach certain levels, or, as you know, is sometimes called fail. And we do see, you know, about a third of our children every year not reaching expected levels in reading, writing, maths at the end of primary, or not reaching a standard pass in English and maths at the end of secondary. And there's no sort of public outcry or kind of, you know, to do about that, as there would be if we saw similar sort of fatality or failure rates in the world of medicine. That's why I called my 2021 book Obstetrics in Schools. It was about what can we learn from the world of obstetrics, which has massively reduced the fatality rate from nearly 50% in 1800 to 0.4% in the UK now. If you can, you know, completely transform people's expectations and assumptions about what's possible, and ensure, you know, the safe delivery of almost every baby through from birth to age 2, then why are we still kind of accepting and even expecting, you know, high fatality rates in education? And I think that, yeah, there's too much evidence to show that you can close gaps and you can support practically every learner to succeed in school, to not have that ambition and aspiration. And part of it, like you say, Hannah, is about helping children to develop their self-belief, and not just to kind of say, you know, you can be anything, you know, and you can wave a magic wand and suddenly you can become, you know, an astronaut or an opera singer or whatever, but to teach them how they can make incremental gains on their previous best, and how they can be better learners and more independent learners and more self-regulating learners, and that, you know, they can sort of be in control of their destiny. That's we know that's sort of really powerful.
Oh, I'm going to embarrass myself now. There's a theory, isn't it? You wrote about it with P. Is it Plimian? No.
Oh, the Pygmalion. The
Pygmalion, that's the one. Because I didn't realise it was an actual thing, and I just think it's so interesting. But I've always been with it with my students. I'm like, right, my class, my whole career, I've always got at least 1 grade above national average. You guys are not going to ruin my trend. You're going to, this is going to be your highest grade.
We're going to do it together.
Subjects. You're going to do really well, and they all raise it because I expect it of them. But also, my school's got a thing that they always kind of go, your teacher talks, whatever that comes out of their mouth is gold. Like, they say everything you need to cheat, the cheat codes to kind of get you to the top. And kind of, they know exactly what you need to do to get the best out of you. Then if you just listen and take that on board, you can really, like, it's kind of work smarter, not harder. And it's like, you can get there, and anyone can get there. You just have to listen to it. But I just find, I didn't realize that was a whole kind of effect, that actually it's one of those that we can get really great results out of kids. But if we think highly of them and think that they can do it, they will raise themselves up. But if actually you think, oh no, you're not going to, they won't make it.
Yeah, so there's two effects, and there's sort of the opposite. The Pygmalion effect is that if you have really high expectations and a really sort of optimistic belief in somebody, they will sense that and they will perform, raise their performance to it. And it was tested by this psychologist called Rosenthal, who took a group of teachers in a school, and he gave each of them the previous scores of the children they were inheriting in the new academic year, so in September. So he sort of said, here are your 30 children. These 5 or 6 at the top are really bright. They're really smart. They did really well last year. They're going to be your absolute kind of, class A-star students. These ones at the bottom, they're kind of like really languishing. They're kind of poor things, we're not expecting you to work miracles with them, just kind of get them through the year. And then he did that with each of the teachers. And at the end of the year, he asked them to sort of give in their scores of how the children had performed in the sort of end of year tests. And lo and behold, the rank order of the children from sort of highest performer to lowest performer was exactly the same, pretty much, as what he'd given them at the beginning of the year. The only problem was the data that he'd given them at the beginning of the year was completely fictitious. So the children that he told the teachers were really bright, there was no evidence of prior, high performance to back that up. But because the teachers had thought, I've really got to hothouse these children, I've really got to challenge them in my language, I've really got to, make sure I give them feedback that pushes them up, they were getting like extra fantastic teaching and intervention. And the children that they felt, this makes it, I'm sounding like, I'm doing a disservice to the teachers, but if they felt the pressure was off a little bit, or they felt that, we're not expecting these children to achieve wonderful things, they accepted lower performance, and they sort of moderated their teaching down, if you like. So the opposite of the Pygmalion effect is the Golem effect, which is the really worrying one, that if you have a low expectation of somebody, which could be because of the way they speak or the way they dress or their postcode or, what their big sister was like when they were at school a few years ago, or, the fact that they got into trouble last year and, they kind of were fighting in the playground. If you have a low expectation as an adult, as a teacher, you're less likely to give positive body language, you're less likely to make eye contact with them, you're less likely to smile at them, you're less likely to spend time with them in class. So you're really kind of massively disadvantaging this child, almost starving them of the kind of oxygen of teacher intervention they need. So there's a wonderful book called Humankind by a guy called Rutger Bregman, who I quote in the book, who has this quote, and I might not say it exactly, but he basically says, you can make people smarter or stupider, brighter or, more successful or not, just by your sort of belief in them. So, which is why we have to be so sort of conscious of unconscious bias. Because it's, it's really easy for us to have high expectations of some learners, lower expectations of others.
I mean, Tom's in the background, so he's going to hate me for saying this, because I am one of those people that go, oh, well, they behave for me. But I think it's because I've always had that high expectations, and just, I don't believe what other people say about kids. I remember at a school a couple of schools ago, and everyone was like, oh my god, this kid's a nightmare, he climbs on tables, he chucks chairs around. And I was like, I must not teach this kid. I'm hearing all this stuff about this kid kicking off, and I was like, I must not teach him. I was like, one day I was like, right, I'm just going to check my register, and I did teach him, and he would just behave for me, and I didn't kind of know that. And I had it that at one point he had languages before mine lesson, and he was walking up and down outside my room, and I'm like, are you all right, are you coming in? He's like, I'm calming down because I want to be in your room, I just need to calm down first. I'm like, it's fine, come in when you're ready. And I would always praise him, we would always get reward points. He would stay behind and help me clean up, and quite often come and wash up at lunch and help me. And I'm like, it's a completely different child because I have different expectations of him. And I think sometimes we can become that. And I remember this year I had a tutor group, our kids are in tutor groups, and I teach the whole of year 9, and I didn't teach any of them last year. So this was the first time I'm meeting these kids, and everyone's like, oh my god, this tutor group's a bit of a nightmare. And actually, like after their first lesson, I went, you know what? I've been told a lot about you, but you've been my favourite Year 9 group all week. Like, I'm like, you're my, and then the next week I was like, you're my favourite Year 9 group to teach. And they're like, oh, we really miss. Oh my gosh, you're the only teacher that said that to us. And they're good as gold and they do really well. And I just think it can work. And it's just a little thing like that, and sharing it with them and making them believe in themselves. And I just think it is something that we're not conscious of, and unless you consciously do it, and that we do kind of need to retrain ourselves a bit.
That you're so right, and they are little things. I mean, I was really conscious writing the book that I was writing for teachers and leaders and heads who are, you know, time poor and have really limited budgets and have very little support, often from external agencies that you'd want to have far more sort of wraparound support from. So I thought I have to be coming up with strategies and solutions that don't cost money and don't take extra time. And the great thing is, so much about what makes a difference and has impact around diversity and inclusion doesn't cost any money. It's about, you know, just a smile rather than a frown. It's about saying hello, Hannah, rather than just saying, all right, you know. It's about just remembering those little things. It's about when a child comes to your lesson and they've missed the previous lesson, not kind of saying, oh, well, you missed all that, you're going to have to catch up on it, you know, communicating that it's a pain in the backside that they weren't there, and just saying, oh, it's so fabulous to see you, we really missed you, you know. And it's just the little nuances of, you know, the language, the body language, the forging relations, the making sure that you're kind of catching children doing things right rather than catching them doing things wrong. It's, you know, it's quite simple stuff really, but it's transformational.
And that's the thing, especially with attendance. If you can get that tone right with teachers, it can help people and make them want to come into school again. We've had Maria B, she messaged in saying, my arts teacher believed in me in secondary education. Although my grades were very low, next term I passed my grades with flying colours and I wanted her to be proud of me. She told me, you can do it, and I did. So I think it's that, like, we all remember that one teacher, didn't we, that believed in us. And we've had another message. I don't know whether your book goes into this much detail, but JBL asked about how to include children from different religious groups that won't allow their children to watch movies or YouTube or listen to music. Is it fair to exclude all of those above one child for 7 years? Like, I guess it's depends on like the group and kind of how you moderate that, because I think every child's going to have a different range. Even like myself, my ex-husband is split, so my son does not kind of watch as much TV or game when he's with me, but he does a lot there. And even if they're from a house that says no, they're still going to be exposed to it in different ways at different points. So it's very hard to balance, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, my book does cover the way in which children and adults can be excluded because of their religion or their culture, and some of the masking behaviours that children and adults deploy to sort of, because they feel the pressure to fit in. So the F chapter is about food, because I think food is really important. I think, you know, eating in school and knowing that children are not hungry in their lessons, and also food as a social time when you come together, I think is quite symbolic. And yet, you know, I'm always saddened when I go to schools where the religious requirements are not sort of met. So when I was head in my most recent school, I had, you know, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, Christian children with no sort of religious faith. And it was a school where we actually, everybody ate in the school dining hall together in the day. And we asked families not to send in packed lunches. We said, you know, we can meet any kind of, you know, allergies, medical requirements, food sort of preferences, but everybody's going to have food. And obviously children entitled to free school meals had a free meal, and children who paid for their food had lunches. And that meant that we had to provide a halal option every day, and for our Muslim children, a non-halal option for our Sikh children who wouldn't eat meat that had been prepared in a halal way. Obviously vegetarian, obviously vegan, obviously, you know, meeting all the kind of allergies. But for us, it was really, really important that we did that, because we wanted everybody, whatever their religion or their culture, to feel that they were being so honoured and respected and seen and included. So that's important. I also talk in my book about staff and how sometimes, you know, if you are, you know, the only member of staff who wears a hijab, you know, that can sometimes be, you can be made to feel sort of different by careless conversation by staff, or if you if it's important for you to pray at certain times a day and leaders aren't sort of receptive and understanding of that, that can be really stressful. So yeah, I look at all sorts of scenarios that can make people feel included or excluded, and both sort of adults and young people.
If you're enjoying this show and enjoying I highly recommend this book. It's one of the best books that I've read this year. Don't forget, you can pop along to John Catt Bookshop, and we've got our obviously Teacher Talk Radio discount code still, so you can use the code JCTTR2425 and you can get your 20% off the A to Z of diversity and inclusion. And you mentioned there about the school, so there's like a part 2 at the end, isn't there? And that's where like you talk about that school. And I've been in one school that does that, where the teachers would go and sit with the students and have lunch, and I've always found that quite a nice one. I wouldn't always do it every day, but some days I would go and do it, and it was just nice. And I've had schools where they would offer teachers free lunch if you would go and sit with them. So some of us would do it on different days, and then you get a lunch and you just go and sit with the kids, and it's that nice. But they kind of did it to the whole extreme, where I mean, like, the idea is it was demonstrating the manners, like not everyone had to, you weren't allowed to leave the table until everybody had finished, and everybody poured the water out and looked after everybody. And I think those kind of traditional manners and things are kind of really good life skills that are lost a little bit as well. I know there's like one of those, oh my gosh, schools need to teach all these extra things, but actually there are kind of little things that we can do just to make them better humans and survive better after school.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did the school that I'm talking about here is the school that I had the real sort of privilege of setting up from scratch. So I was in that wonderful kind of position of being able to design a school from the beginnings and thinking about how do we want to do curriculum, how do we want to do lunchtimes, how do we want to do, everything. And we did decide that we were going to have a dining policy where we paid for all staff to have a free lunch every day, but to come down to the canteen and eat that. And if they had the time to sit with children and talk with children and interact with them. Obviously, if they didn't, they could, just have a quick lunch and then sort of disappear. But it helped in so many different ways to build relationships, to help children to feel included, to really learn about children as humans, as opposed to just, a child in my maths class or a child in my class in year 5 or whatever. So, you'd hear wonderful conversations that were about what you'd watched on television the night before, or your favorite football team, or your pet rabbit, or sometimes people would have conversations around those, those thunks, would you rather be able to be invisible or fly? You'd have a whole lunchtime discussion around something like that, or, just philosophical questions. And it was a really good way of developing oracy and confidence and being able to look out for those children that might otherwise get a little bit sort of lost or isolated at lunchtime. It was a really good way of cutting down on incidents, behavioural incidents at lunchtime, because there was a sort of staff presence all around.
Oh, I think we've lost you, Rachel. Are you still there?
Have I come back?
Oh, yeah. Yes, you're back.
Yeah. I saw a wheel of doom for a minute.
I was like, oh, no, we've gone. And what, I found quite interesting, which is all about the gap. So I know that we talk about COVID and we blame, everyone's like, oh, you just need to stop talking about COVID now. But actually, I feel like the repercussions are still there, and I feel like they're still going to be there for quite some time. I mean, my school has hired a primary school teacher to work with some of our year 7s because they are just so far behind. And I know I spoke to one of my friends who works at another school down the road, and they're literally hiring the same thing this week. And I just think that's a sign of the changes of the times, that that gap is much bigger than we think. And certainly I guess it's to do with that home life. Those kids that would had those conversations around the dinner table versus the ones that were kind of left and didn't really do anything. So therefore the gap between those children is massive. Do you actually think we can properly close it, or is it that we just have to do our best to try and get it as close as we can?
Yeah. So I talk in the book about schools that have closed that gap. And, sometimes they do it longitudinally, year after year after year. Sometimes it's a little bit spiky, it closes one year and then it opens up again another year, or it's closed in a subject like art, but it's open in a subject like geography, or, it's closed for one group, say your pupil premium manageable learners, but it opens up a sort of gender gap or a gap between children of different ethnicities. But you know, at Isaac Newton, my school, we pretty much eliminated most gaps by most measures every year, just by really, really deliberately targeting the students that needed more intervention and more support, almost needed like those kind of surrogate members of the cavalcade or entourage sort of around them. I do write in the G chapter, though, that I think there is such a thing, and it's kind of, there's some research that I kind of quote in there, as kind of almost having a gap fetish. I think sometimes people can get really kind of transfixed by, you know, talking about the gap. And then, of course, if you're in a group that traditionally or nationally tends to perform less well, you can really feel the burden of that. And there's some really interesting research around Black children in America feeling that narrative of Black children don't do as well as white children, and feeling that pressure to the extent that it actually hinders their performance, because they're sort of feeling like, you know, hyper responsible for performing really well in order to be able to sort of challenge that narrative. So, and I also think that, you know, how you present gap information, you need to do it carefully, because you don't want to sort of almost excuse or explain away differences. You know, if a school has had I don't know, their boys in English performing less well than their girls in English for 10 years running, as an English teacher, and if your boys don't do as well, you could kind of say, oh, well, you know, that was just inevitable. That's what happens around here at this school. So it can sometimes lead to lowered expectations. So I think you have to just be really, really careful. And of course, you don't want to close gaps by bringing everybody's performance down and flatlining. You want to sort of, you know, raise those groups that aren't doing so well up to the high performance of everyone else. So I think it's a really complex issue. It was funny when, you know, when you write something, then a few months later, you kind of think, oh, I wish I'd written that differently. And you're probably aware that just before Christmas last year, Tim Brighouse died really sadly. I don't know if you remember Tim Brighouse, but he was just a real tour de force in the world of education. And there have been a number of more memorial events for him in recent months, and a book that's just come out, which I contributed to, called Unfinished Business, about what, you know, Tim would want us as educators to be continuing to lobby for and, you know, and change in the world of education. And through all of that, I was reminded of this wonderful thing that Tim Brighouse used to often say about school leaders. He'd say, as school leaders, you have to find the gaps in the hedges. In other words, you're working in a really kind of tight, constricted situation. You've got limited resource, limited funding, you know, policies that don't necessarily help you do the right things for children. So it's like, you know, you're confronted by a hedge, but there will be gaps somewhere. And, you know, your job is to find the gap and to crawl through the gap. And I now kind of wish that I'd called the gaps section like kind of gaps in the hedges, and written about that, how really great leaders who are up to great stuff always find the gaps in the hedges.
That's just so beautifully said. And I just think, like, I'm quite interested and started kind of reading around the whole gap between boys and girls, and how kind of girls generally seem to outperform boys, and why that is. And is it that they just have the rigor to do the revision, to the discipline to do it, or how do we transfer that to the boys and raise their aspirations and kind of have proper role models for the HPAs to kind of bring them up? I find that bit, I think that's my education bet. I reckon that it will go for the next bit. But I just think there's so many lovely bits. And have you got a favourite chapter, or a favourite letter, I should say?
Oh, it kind of changes all the time. One of my favourites, which is quite sort of emotional for me to write, because I write about two of the people I love most in the world, my husband and my dad, was the end chapter, Noticing. So the Noticing chapter starts with a lovely quote from Margaret Mulholland, who's a great sort of specialist on SEND. And she says, noticing is the teacher's superpower. Which I really like. And it's about, you know, teachers, leaders, operational staff in schools, anybody in a school who's really, you know, got the kind of diversity and inclusion bug. They're just constantly noticing things. They're noticing the child who comes in the, you know, in the shoes with a hole in, or the kind of grimy shirt, and thinking, you know, is she or he okay at home? They're noticing the child that's a bit sort of quiet. They're noticing the child who gets picked up by a mum at the end of the day who, you know, puts her arm around her and then, you know, chats to her about her day, and they walk animatedly down the street, compared to the kid who gets picked up by a mum who's on her phone and doesn't even kind of talk to them, and then is walking, you know, a few yards away, and there's no sort of interaction. They just notice everything, and they see where there might be deficiencies or deficits, and they do their best to sort of plug the gaps and compensate for them. And I wrote about this wonderful teacher that my husband had when he was at primary school. So when my husband was 10, his dad died very suddenly, and the family was like a big family with lots of siblings, and they didn't have very much money anyway, but suddenly they were really sort of thrown into poverty and, you know, obviously coping with this bereavement. And he told me that he had this wonderful teacher who wasn't even his class teacher. She wasn't anybody who taught him directly, but she just noticed that he was like this really sad little boy who was coming to school, you know, just completely his world had fallen apart. And she and another teacher said to him, you know what, we'd really like to take you out one Saturday. We'd like to take you down to town, and we could go and, you know, do something. You could choose what you wanted to do, and you could bring one of your friends along. And they had this amazing day, and they went to the planetarium, and they went to see some other sites, and they had lunch in London. And she just gave him a lovely day out with a friend of hers, another teacher. And he just kind of remembers that to this day and talks about her as being this amazing person who noticed this. And then I write about my dad, who was a head teacher and a head of a sixth form college, and how there was a real culture of sort of noticing staff who were, you know, were struggling a little bit. And they had a teacher at the school who was a drama teacher who suddenly just one day didn't turn up for work, and the family didn't know. The family didn't know where he was, and obviously the school didn't know where he was, and everyone was really worried about him. He'd just gone missing. But the department had noticed that he was kind of really struggling with his mental health, and they'd also noticed that he'd got really sort of particularly interested in homelessness and people who were living rough. And it was at the time when under Waterloo Station there was that sort of cardboard city. This is going back years, you know, 70s, 80s. And he got really interested in the community that sort of lived there. And so my dad thought, you know what, I just think he might have gone to London. He might be kind of living in Cardboard City. So after kind of long day at work, he got on the train from sort of deepest depths of Hampshire and went up to London and just spent the night walking the streets of London and talking to people, you know, who were homeless on the streets in Cardboard City, trying to find this drama teacher. And he didn't find him, but then on a rota, different people went successive nights, and a couple of weeks later, somebody who did the kind of rota found him and brought him back. And it's that kind of thing of, you know, people that go the extra mile because they notice something isn't quite right, and they just, you know, care for you like you would care for somebody in your family. And, you know, I think those are really, really lovely stories.
I think it's teaching is quite often a thankless job, and we kind of get given all the tasks and things, but actually we're not very good at looking after ourselves. We're quite often will put the students first and won't necessarily do what's right by us. And actually it's having those really good colleagues that will go, right, you need to go home. I remember working when I was very heavily pregnant until like 7 o'clock at night, and my deputy used to come around and was like, right, you need to go home now. I'm kicking you out. You're not allowed to be here. And it sometimes it is just having those other people and looking out for each other. And I think that isn't kind of necessary. You don't want that moaning community in the staff room, like, oh, this and oh, this. You want that kind of everyone to feel very seen and known. And I've talked about it very openly in previous shows that I was a victim of domestic violence and kind of spoke about that on my shows. And actually then I got really into it and kind of then started working with charities and helping other women. And I didn't realize the amount of it. It's like one in 30. So there's at least 1 or 2 teachers in every school going through that situation. And then I started having other teachers reach out to me and be like, somebody's confided in me. How do I help them to get out of that situation? What do I do? And I think it's that kind of thing of being in a school, you just think you get carried away with the day, and actually we kind of really remember that we are human, and just what we're very good at acting as teachers and putting on a facade and kind of performing in our teacher role, but actually there can be a lot of other things. But also teaching is also amazing, and the amount of times I've been in the cupboard crying and then like come out and then the kids have said something and I've like absolutely burst into laughter, and I'm like, I thought I was going to
Yeah.
really struggle today, but actually the kids have carried me and got me through. And I think that's people don't talk about that side of the profession. Like teaching can really get you through stuff and kind of get you to the other side, and that's what's great. Like everyone's like, oh, everyone's leaving teaching. No, come and be a teacher, because honestly, you can't beat that feeling of kind of being like, you get as much out of the kids as you put into them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, you can't really call yourself a truly inclusive school if you're not really working on including every member of staff. So I write a lot about adults in this book, not just about, inclusion and diversity for children, because it's all wrapped up in the same thing. I was visiting this amazing pupil referral unit the other day, and the head teacher was saying it's really important. We take children who've had really sort of, damaging experiences in mainstream school, and often by the time they come to us, their self-esteem and their self-efficacy is rock bottom, and they're really fragile and just sort of broken almost. And so we have to build up their self-efficacy and their belief in themselves. But there's no point doing that with them until we've done that with our staff. Because if our staff don't feel like, they've got superpowers and that they're in a really sort of inclusive and supportive environment, then it's really difficult for us to do that, for the children. And so he was talking about amazing things that he does with his staff, like, a training session where everybody will be given time to go away and do a little sort of presentation, which could be a written presentation, a little kind of guide or pamphlet, or it could be actually preparing an oral presentation that you then give to the staff about something that you have sort of lived experience of. So somebody might give a presentation on living with arthritis, or supporting a parent with Alzheimer's, or coping, having had an alcohol addiction, things that just really I suppose make them an expert, but also show their trust in the community, that they can sort of be open and everyone else can understand them, and a little sort of glimpse into their life and some of the challenges that they're contending with, and see them more as a whole person. And I just thought, gosh, that's so powerful, to have developed that staff culture where people feel they can do that. And that must be just so empowering, and must, really give them strength.
It's exactly that. And I my old school kind of cottoned on, and I work quite closely for the kids that were in that situation, and actually like they automatically seem to gravitate towards me anyway. I was obviously a very safe space for them because I kind of got it and would let them kind of be their place to kind of let it out. But I never really, it's that barrier. I never know how much I can say. And I'm like, I'd just be like, I really understand. I can't say too much, but I really get it. Don't you worry. And you will survive and you will thrive. And I think sometimes there is that thing in kids that they don't have that resilience yet. They don't know that to go through hardship is normal. No life is just happy sailing forever. Everyone's going to experience grief or some kind of tragedy or some kind of barrier that they're going to have to overcome that they don't kind of realize. And like my because I love all the Senko stuff in there as well, and my son's deaf and also has a speech delay, so he's got the two kind of and he's got ADHD, so it's like any distraction that's emphasized with the hearing aids, and I'm like, oh, bless his little cotton socks in school. But it's understanding that, and kind of I understand my students when I talk to them about hearing aids. They actually taught me quite a lot about it when I had my son, and I was like, one of my year 11s, I was like, can you explain to me what it's like, because my son can't talk and can't tell me, and he explained it all to me, and then would always be like, how's your son going, how's he getting on? And it is that kind of inclusivity, but like you said, it's using those teachers their experience. We had a teacher covering maternity last year who was deaf and had a sign interpreter, and then some of the staff have learned sign. We had a sign club and the kids all learned sign, so they could sign. He would sign to them certain things and they would sign back. And it is like sometimes we don't know about these different things, and it is just exposure to them that can make it more kind of normal and inclusive and kind of things like that. And I think I won't hold you too much longer, because like I said, we barely touched all the letters. There's so much in here to read. But also from my personal perspective, because obviously with the those of you that are regularly listening, I'm doing my level 7 apprenticeship in senior leadership, and I love the kind of the extra bit at the end. You've got lots of kind of tables that you can work through, and kind of actual working documents in terms of thinking like pupil premium funding and like where that goes and how to use it. So I just think there's loads of tools in it as well that kind of make it really practical, and also really think about how you're doing it properly and tick all those boxes as a senior leader as well of kind of what you're doing with the school.
I don't know about you, but I just think books need to have practical examples. It really frustrates me when you read a book and it says, you should really have a school policy about this. And I think, well, yeah, give me an example, or start me off, or give me a start of a 10. So there are a couple of places where I say, have you thought about articulating what you mean by great parental engagement? What would a parental engagement policy look like? Or, if it's really important to think about the language we use of inclusion, how about having a language for learning policy in your school? And then I'll give an exemplar, or the first few paragraphs of one. And it's not necessarily saying this is the best one in the world, but it's just saying this is an example of how you could start it, or what some wording you might use, or what the structure could look like. So there are lots of examples, and often policies and things that have been written by students, examples of this might be a job description for if you go out to advert for students for an EDI group, or this might be a really good uniform and hair policy for an inclusive school that's really understanding of Afro-textured hair, for example. Just where I've come across really nice examples, I include them.
Like I said, it's such a great book, and thank you so much for coming and chatting to me about it. And like I said, we've got quite a lot of the A to Z series coming up, and I think there was another one on Monday as well. So if anybody kind of wants to go back and listen to those, or look forward to listening to the rest of the shows, I just think it's such a delightful series, and I'm so excited. I've read this one, I'm going to go read the others, because I feel like they're that collection that you need on your shelf in your staff room CPD library. It's definitely one to have. But thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Hannah. It's been lovely chatting to you and learning a bit about you too.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your week.
And you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So if you've enjoyed tonight's show and do want to go read the A to Z of Diversity and Inclusion, you can go find it on the John Catt website, and don't forget our code TTR2425 for 20% off your order. And if you're like, oh, I really enjoyed listening to that, maybe I want to come on and talk about a topic that I'm passionate about, then do drop us a message over on Twitter or LinkedIn, and come and be on our show and come and talk about something in education that you want to discuss or you're excited about. I mean, there was lots of topics on there that could have been shows in themselves. So if there's anything that's kind of gone, oh yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about that, or have a chat, or have a bit of a debate. We love a bit of debate on that. Then you can do and get in touch. Or maybe you're like, actually, this is right up my street, and actually I'd quite like to become a host. Maybe you're following in my footsteps and you're doing your level 7 apprenticeship and you need something to do those 6 hours of off-the-job training. Then getting to read these lovely, amazing books and interview these amazing authors is such a lovely, amazing perk of being one of the hosts at Teacher Talk Radio. So we have a few spots left. So if you'd like to get in contact and have a go at one of those, then you can do. And like I said, we've got all the different A to Zs coming up. We've got some really kind of big ranging books that are in part of their collection. Some of them have been released. Some of them are still to be released. So I've got another one coming up that won't be until the new year. So we've got a real range as we'll be following this series. And they are just so easy to read and such really interesting topics. And I think as busy teachers, we want stuff that we can dip in and out of, but also will make us think about how we are teaching and improve our teaching. And most importantly, the thing about it all, and the thing that I love specifically about this book and talking to it about Rachel about it, is the fact that it's about the kids. They are the most important thing they're why we do what we do. It's so important that we are focusing what we're doing around them, not the big O, not anybody, not our senior leadership, that everything we do in our classroom is helping to improve our students to be better humans, to achieve more, to build more resilience, and to be able to go off into the wider world and succeed to the level and aspirations with ambition in whatever they want to go and do, and find their passion and find their happy and go off and live amazing lives. So it's such a reflective book in kind of making you think about those things and helping you with stepping stones in trying to find that inclusive place where school can be a really positive place. And you could be that teacher, you can be that person that really makes a difference in your students' life, and you can turn it around and make them feel like they belong and make them feel like they really genuinely can achieve, and they are worth so much more than they ever thought they could be. So do go and have a read. Like I said, it's been one of the favorite books that I've read this year, so do go and have a look at it. And I'm just going to play a little video so you can see the John Catt website in action and where you can find and buy this book.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. John Catt have an exceptional collection of book titles that cover a range of educational topics, ideas and research. The books are aimed at forward-thinking schools and support best practice teaching for both primary and secondary education. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
So there you go. That's where everything is over on John Catt, and you can find the A to Z series on there. Like we said, it's Roy Blatchford who has organised the series and put this together. So if Rachel's anything to go by, I imagine the other authors are also incredibly good and knowledgeable in their fields. So there's A to Z of leadership, there's A to Z of literacy, so there's all sorts on there. So go and check them all out and keep an eye out for when the other shows arrive here on Teachers Talk Radio. I'll be back next week. I think we're back on our Tuesday slot with me and Lucy. So if you're having Lucy withdrawal, she will be back next week. Don't you worry. And we're going to have a previous guest on. So I've been visited. Farzan is going to come on, and she's going to talk about attainment in students. So that will kind of follow on nicely on to that show. So if you're or if you want to get in touch and you be on a show, then you can do so. Me and Lucy will be both hyper fixating on lots of different things and going on lots of tangents. So I think lots of you are enjoying and being entertained by that fact. So do come and listen to that. Or if you missed me and Lucy this week, then you can go back and watch our last week's show, which was on interview techniques and prepping, and also kind of checking out more you interviewing the school and what to look out for to make sure you're finding the right school for you. And we've had some great shows as well. Before that, we had talking about neurodiversity in ourselves. We learned a lot about having 3 neurodiverse people on a screen. It was quite entertaining. And then we've had equality for women in education as well, which is a little bit touched on in terms of how we have unconscious bias towards teachers. So we talk about unconscious bias towards women in education. So that's another great show to go and listen to. So I hope you've enjoyed tonight. Like I said, go and check out the books. It's such a great read. And I will see you next week.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.